Today, we're diving into the core idea of Sai Deepak's book, India, that is Bharat. And it's a pretty provocative idea, one that challenges when we think colonialism actually ended, and even questions the very foundations of modern India.
So let me just ask you a simple question. When did colonialism in India officially end? I'm willing to bet a very specific date just popped into your head, right?
Yep, 1947, the year of independence. That's the date we all learn in school, the moment that's supposed to mark the end of an era. But this book comes along and asks a fascinating question that just flips that whole idea on its head.
What if 1947 was just about removing the hardware, the British physically left, but the software, the entire operating system they installed in the country's mind, what if that's still running today? This is the book's central metaphor, and it draws a line between the act of colonization and something much, much deeper.
And that deeper thing is called coloniality. It's not about whether a colonizer is physically there. No, it's about the worldview, the categories, the power structures they left behind that continue to shape everything, from law to education, long after the flags have changed. So to really understand this software, the book argues, we have to look at the original source code.
And the book traces this source code all the way back to a very specific time and place, 15th century Europe, and the religious ideas that were used to justify the whole age of discovery.
Now look at this. What's so wild is how upfront this is. This isn't some modern-day interpretation. This is from the Papal Bull of 1493, basically an official decree that gave Spain and Portugal the green light to go out and colonize. And it says right there, the goal is to overthrow barbarous nations and bring them to the faith. So conquest, from the very beginning, wasn't just about politics or economics. It was framed as a divine mission.
From there, this whole framework went through some major updates inside Europe. The book argues that something like the Protestant Reformation didn't end this worldview, it just created competition. That led to the Peace of Westphalia, which gave us the modern nation-state. But, and this is a huge but, it wasn't about being secular. It was about each state getting to pick its own brand of Christianity. Then you get to the Enlightenment, and they take all these ideas soaked in Christian theology and repackage them as universal, secular truths for everyone.
So here's the crucial point the book makes. The very idea that we have today of separating religion from the secular, that wasn't some universal truth discovered by humanity. It came directly from a very specific internal Christian debate about who was boss, the Pope or the King. And that distinction was then exported to the rest of the world as the only modern way to be, even though its very DNA was Christian. So when this European worldview, shaped by centuries of its own religious conflicts, finally landed in places like India, it crashed headfirst into something completely different. It was a fundamental clash of operating systems.
The book calls the indigenous worldview relational, and you can really see it in these images. You have this idea of a reciprocal give-and-take relationship with nature, and you see Bharatiya not as a political map with borders, but as a sacred geography, a living being defined by its rivers and mountains. The idea was that people weren't owners of the land, they were custodians within the land.
And that's the core difference right there. For the colonizer, land was territory. It was an object, something external that you could map, you could own, and you could exploit. For the indigenous consciousness, land was a living, breathing thing that you were a part of. One is about possession, the other is about belonging. And these two worldviews, they were just completely incompatible.
So how do you install this new operating system? Well, the book says it was a very conscious project, and it was carried out using two main tools, education and law. I mean, it doesn't get much more explicit than this quote from Macaulay in 1835. He's laying the mission out in plain sight. The goal wasn't just to teach English. It was to create a whole new elite class of people who would be, in his words, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste. People who would be cut off from their own civilization so they could help run the colonial one. It's like, to install new software, you first have to format the hard drive.
And this same process happened in the legal system. The British came across this huge variety of Indic traditions, or sampradayas. But their legal framework only understood religion through its own lens, which expected one holy book, a clear clergy, specific doctrines. So what did they do? They took whatever kind of fit that model and called it Hindu law. Everything else, all the lived, local, diverse practices, that was just dismissed as custom or superstition. They didn't just misunderstand these traditions, they fundamentally changed them.
And this had very real consequences. The book points out that even after independence, Indian courts, using this inherited colonial language, turned to the Oxford English Dictionary to figure out what a religious denomination is. The definition they found, needing a common faith and organization, fit a Christian church perfectly. But for many native Dharma groups, not so much. So by using a definition from an imported dictionary, the law itself struggled to even recognize traditions that didn't fit that imported mold.
Okay, so this all leads to the book's final and most provocative argument, that this colonial software isn't just floating around in society, it's actually embedded in the very constitutional foundation of modern India.
After World War I, you have the League of Nations talking about this standard of civilization. Sounds pretty noble, right? A sacred trust. But the book argues this was just a way to make European norms the universal standard for everyone else. Nations were judged on whether they could stand by themselves. And the measuring stick for that was, you guessed it, the European model of a nation-state.
And here is the crucial connection. The Government of India Act of 1919, which basically created the blueprint for India's modern government, was passed at the exact same time the League of Nations was setting up this global standard. The book argues that this was no accident. The act was a direct product of this new international colonial order.
So the whole thesis is that the constitutional framework that independent India got in 1947 wasn't a fresh start. It was really just the final version of a process that began way back with the 1919 Act, a document that was born from a colonial worldview and designed to shape India into a very specific, civilized image.
And that leaves us with the huge central question of the whole book. If a nation's foundational operating system, its constitution, its legal language, its state structures, is an inheritance from the colonial era, can that society ever be truly decolonized? The book suggests that maybe true independence isn't just about changing a flag. It's about consciously examining and maybe, just maybe, rewriting the foundational code itself.